In this video, you'll see a presentation by Dr. Brian Worden on brain plasticity and tinnitus. Dr. Worden went to UCSF Medical School and completed his residency at Stanford. I hope you enjoy the talk. Here we go.
So this is an outline of what we're going to talk about today, and we're first going to talk about why we think tinnitus starts and why it seems to linger in some people, causing distress and impairing their quality of life. We're then going to touch on the processes of sensory gating and habituation, so we understand the tools that the brain typically uses to tune out tinnitus. And finally, we'll focus on the process of neuroplasticity and how we can harness this natural mechanism to rewire our brains in healthy ways and quiet burdensome tinnitus. Now, we all know that tinnitus is a common condition. It affects probably almost 20% of the population. Most experts feel that tinnitus develops as a natural side effect of normal compensatory mechanisms that occur within the auditory system of the brain in response to decreased stimulation because of some degree of hearing loss, even if the hearing loss is too mild or too high frequency to be documented on a standard hearing test. For the majority of people that experience tinnitus at some point in their lives, their brains quickly recognize that the tinnitus signal is neither dangerous nor important, and it is thus tuned out of their conscious awareness and never becomes bothersome. However, for some, their brains mistakenly classify the tinnitus signal as a potential danger that must be monitored. And for these unfortunate folks, the tinnitus persists as a bothersome perception that then triggers a stress response and an emotional response that amplify the suffering. So let's talk a little bit more about what I mean when I say that most people naturally tune out their tinnitus. So our brains are constantly being bombarded with sensory information from our eyes, ears, touch receptors, smell receptors, and taste receptors. And we honestly don't have the attentional bandwidth to actually consciously experience all of it. So in order for us to function and survive, we rely on subconscious centers in our brains to filter all of this incoming sensory information and selectively amplify the pertinent information, sending that stuff to our conscious awareness while suppressing the sensory information that is unimportant and non-threatening. Now, most of this happens very rapidly in real time via a process that's called sensory gating, that involves a complex network of interactions between several brain areas called the prefrontal cortex, the thalamus, and the basal ganglia. This sensory gating process also helps us to ignore distracting sensory information when we're consciously trying to focus our spotlight of attention on one thing in our environment, like when we're trying to listen specifically to the voice of our friend sitting across from us while ignoring the background noise in a crowded restaurant. So for people with persistent tinnitus, the first level of failure occurred here. Their sensory gating mechanism did not suppress the tinnitus signal. But there is another method that our brains use to tune out non-threatening stimuli, and that is called habituation.
If you have tinnitus ringing in the ears and want to speak to a doctor like me, click the link right here to book a free call with Treble Health. A doctor from my team will be able to speak with you, review your case, and provide next steps towards the solution that can get you relief, better sleep, and bring the tinnitus levels down over time. Just click that link right there on the screen, book a free call today. Now, back to our podcast.
Now, habituation is slower and a more simplistic neurologic process that even small animals with less complex nervous systems can display. Essentially, when a stimulus is presented repeatedly and it does not result in an arousal-producing effect, either positive or negative, the brain will eventually reduce or inhibit responsiveness to that stimulus. As an example of this, I like to describe the adaptation to the sound of one's refrigerator running. So there is a near constant buzzing sound emanating from the refrigerators in our kitchens. However, over time, several things occur in our brains in response to this sound. First of all, our brains become familiar with it because of repeat exposure. Secondly, our brains classify the sound as unimportant and non-threatening, so it doesn't elicit an arousal response like fear, annoyance, or pleasure. And then eventually the brain actually inhibits our awareness of this sound such that we are generally not conscious of its presence unless we actively try to listen to it. We are thus habituated to the sound of our refrigerators. Another example of habituation involves people who live near noisy train tracks. Over time, their bodies become habituated to the sound of the trains roaring by such that it is eventually barely noticeable to them. For many people, their habituation to tinnitus is blocked because they developed, through no fault of their own, a chronic stress response or emotional reaction to the tinnitus. They may be thinking about the tinnitus all the time, stressing about the tinnitus, fighting the tinnitus, or worrying about the tinnitus. As such, many of the most effective treatments for tinnitus aim to calm the maladaptive aversive reactions that many people develop in response to tinnitus so we can allow the natural habituation process to occur. But what is key to understand is that the structure, organization, and connectivity pattern of the adult human brain is not fixed and invariable like scientists used to think. Our wiring is constantly evolving based on our experiences, behaviors, and exposures. And this process is called neuroplasticity. What neuroscientists observe is that neural pathways that are repeatedly used over and over become strengthened and reinforced. And as these brain areas are bolstered, their functionality improves. Eventually, through extensive practice, we can actually see structural changes in the brain on imaging studies from this kind of repetitive reinforcement. So in very real terms, our brains actually change in response to how we think and what we do. Here are some examples. If a person lifts weights in the gym and increases the size of their bicep muscles, the area of the brain that is designated for controlling that muscle also becomes larger. And a well-documented English study revealed that London taxi drivers have a larger brain region involved in memory called the hippocampus than do bus drivers. And this is attributed to their need to constantly use complex spatial information to navigate new roads in unknown areas, as opposed to bus drivers who follow a more limited set of routes. It's important to understand, however, that depending on what is being practiced, neuroplastic changes can be either helpful or detrimental. In addition, it has been shown that repetitive negative thinking patterns can cause detrimental neuroplastic changes that predispose to conditions like anxiety and depression. But what does this have to do with tinnitus, you might be asking? Well, this topic is related to tinnitus in a few ways. First of all, most researchers feel that the reason that temporary tinnitus transitions to chronic tinnitus is because the abnormal neural signaling that caused the tinnitus becomes ingrained and reinforced due to maladaptive neuroplasticity. And it is also likely true that a person that constantly focuses their attention on their tinnitus all day drives neuroplastic changes that reinforce that monitoring and awareness, ultimately making the tinnitus more difficult to ignore. Many studies that have actually examined the connections and structures of the human brain using various imaging techniques have shown that people with persistent bothersome tinnitus have alterations in the connections and levels of activity in various brain regions that involve hearing, attention, introspection, stress, and emotion. But the good news is that we can also utilize the power of neuroplasticity to make positive changes in the brain that ultimately quiet tinnitus. And I think this realization can be enormously empowering to people. Many folks suffering with tinnitus feel hopeless and powerless because of this tormenting sensation and the negative effects that it has caused on their body and overall well-being. But when we show people that there are real, intentional practices, behaviors, lifestyle changes, and interventions that they can do to modulate their own neurobiology in healthy ways and calm their tinnitus, it helps give them back a sense of control. It turns the tables so they feel that they have the power and agency to overcome tinnitus and reclaim their well-being. Let me give you a brief overview of a few tools we have available and what practices have been most helpful for my patients. First of all, I'm a huge proponent of various forms of contemplative practice to help people with bothersome tinnitus. Now, I know that many people have an automatic gut reaction when they hear terms like mindfulness, meditation, and yoga. These terms are often equated with some form of Eastern voodoo or hippie fad. But there is actually a mountain of neuroscience research that supports the power of contemplative practices to change our brains and behaviors in healthy ways. Think of contemplative practices as mental exercises that are done to strengthen helpful brain function. Just like an elite athlete uses regular physical exercise and training to improve their muscle strength, speed, agility, and physical performance, contemplative practices are brain training, where beneficial neural pathways are strengthened over time to improve vital mental functions, including self-awareness, attentional control, insight, and self-regulation. I recommend mindfulness education and practice for almost all of my patients with intrusive tinnitus, and there is strong clinical research to support its effectiveness. In fact, there have been several randomized controlled trials published in the clinical research that have demonstrated the effectiveness of mindfulness interventions in reducing the severity of tinnitus. And it's clear that many of the benefits of mindfulness practice are mediated through neuroplastic changes in the brain. Multiple studies have documented that people who engage in mindfulness meditation have structural differences in several areas of the brain compared with non-meditating people. These include increased volumes of brain areas involved in learning, problem solving, emotional regulation, and memory, and a decreased volume of the amygdala, one of the main structures of the limbic system that we feel plays a role in the tinnitus-related distress that many people experience. Contemplative practices like mindfulness also train people to better regulate their attention and change their relationships with thoughts, emotions, and body sensations, which many of my tinnitus patients have found helpful. So on a practical level, how does a person learn more about using mindfulness and other contemplative practices? Well, as Ben said, I offer an online course aimed at helping people with intrusive tinnitus, and teaching mindfulness practices tailored to this purpose is an important aspect of this course. And you can learn more about that offering at alleviatetinnitusTherapy.com. But you can also take formal courses on mindfulness both online and at universities or meditation centers. There are also apps like Headspace or Calm that teach some of the basics of mindfulness and meditation. And finally, there are several great books that provide an excellent foundation for starting a mindfulness practice. I generally recommend starting with a book by Jon Kabat-Zinn, like Wherever You Go, There You Are, but there are many other great books that have been written by others. The next tool we'll discuss is cognitive behavioral therapy. This is an intervention most commonly provided by a psychologist, and it teaches people with bothersome tinnitus to recognize and alter unhelpful patterns of thinking and behavior related to their response to tinnitus and to improve their coping skills. Of all the treatments for tinnitus that have been studied in clinical research, cognitive behavioral therapy has the largest number of studies that support its effectiveness at reducing the severity of tinnitus. And many of the benefits of CBT are achieved by reversing detrimental neuroplastic changes in the brains of tinnitus sufferers that were triggered by unhealthy reactive thought patterns and behaviors. In turn, psychologists administering cognitive behavioral therapy help people practice different, more productive thought patterns and behaviors that are thus reinforced via neuroplasticity, leading to lasting improvements in tinnitus-related distress. And imaging studies have confirmed that CBT induces neuroplastic changes in the connections between the prefrontal cortex, involved in decision-making and self-regulation, and limbic regions like the amygdala, which plays a role in the fearful and emotional response to tinnitus. Now, the third practice that I'll mention today is positive thinking exercises. Now, this is another term that will sometimes trigger an eye roll from my patients. But again, this is an intervention that is supported by solid neuroscience research. As we've discussed, many people that are most troubled by tinnitus have developed strong negative mental and emotional reactions to this perception. That might include concentration difficulties, frustration, anxiety, self-criticism, depression, hopelessness, and a reduced sense of enjoyment. And these issues can really ruin a person's quality of life. Now, many of these reactions are strongly influenced by recurrent negative thinking patterns and our brain's negativity bias. And again, because of neuroplasticity, these negative thinking patterns become hardwired into our brains over time, contributing to lasting discontent. But we can deliberately and intentionally counteract and reverse some of that unhealthy neuroplasticity by engaging in regular positive thinking exercises. And research has shown that practices fostering gratitude, optimism, and self-compassion can have many benefits, including improved mood, enhanced subjective well-being, better work performance, improved health, enriched relationships, and even help us live longer. A lot of the research on this subject has been pioneered by doctors Martin Seligman and Kristen Neff, and the exercises that they recommend include simple things like keeping a daily gratitude journal or spending a few minutes every day sending a positive email or text message praising or thanking someone you know. I advise checking out recommendations from Dr. Neff at her website, selfcompassion.org, or reading one of the excellent books published by Dr. Seligman. Now, these activities may seem silly or insubstantial to some, but they can really help reinforce positive neural networks involving our mood and attitude, and this can reduce many of the most troublesome emotional and psychological reactions to tinnitus that drive much of the suffering. For instance, one clinical study demonstrated that doing positive thinking exercises for just 1 week can have beneficial effects on mood and happiness lasting for up to 6 months afterwards. So imagine the benefit if you incorporated such practices into your regular routine. Now, the last intervention that I'll mention is a little different because it doesn't involve a mental exercise or a behavior change. It involves using a device. I'm sure most of you have heard of the bimodal neuromodulation device called Linear, produced by Neuromod, and perhaps also the similar bimodal neuromodulation device being developed by Dr. Susan Shore's group at the University of Michigan. The reason I wanted to mention these products is because they are thought to produce their benefits by promoting beneficial neuroplastic changes in areas of the auditory system. The background science behind these devices is based on some animal studies that suggested that tinnitus may be caused by abnormal neural firing in an area of the auditory system called the dorsal cochlear nucleus, and that by providing a certain pattern of simultaneous somatosensory and auditory stimulation, that neuroplastic changes would occur, reducing the abnormal firing in the dorsal cochlear nucleus and quieting the tinnitus. Now, I've read all of the clinical studies published about the performance of the Linear device, and my impressions honestly are mixed. It's clear that the device is helping some people, especially those with more severe tinnitus, but it's unfortunately not the tinnitus cure that many people were hoping for. And a small percentage of patients actually reported worsening of their tinnitus while using this device. And I suspect that subsequent studies with the device from Dr. Susan Shore's team will likely report similar results. So at this point, I don't discourage my patients from trying Linear, but I do think that there are cheaper, evidence-based approaches that can be just as effective for most patients with tinnitus. Now, I also want to point out that there are clearly some lifestyle changes that seem to create an internal environment in the nervous system that is most conducive to promoting neuroplasticity. And these include getting plenty of quality sleep, eating a well-balanced diet, low in refined carbohydrates and saturated fats, and engaging in regular exercise, ideally a combination of both aerobic exercise and resistance training. Research also suggests that optimizing all three of these lifestyle factors actually creates a synergistic effect in promoting brain health and neuroplasticity.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Worden. Very comprehensive, just as I would expect being an ENT physician.
Thank you.
The first question that I've seen here is, for people who are just getting started with one of these approaches that might be referred to as neuroplasticity programs, you could say, what do you recommend they start with? Maybe that's your program, maybe that's something else. What are some good baby steps to warm up to the idea of it?
I think probably if somebody wants to start off with something, I would look into learning a little bit about mindfulness because I think that the lessons from mindfulness and the practices of mindfulness can really help us change our relationship with tinnitus. And there's a lot of good resources out there right now. And so if somebody wants to first approach this kind of treatment algorithm for tinnitus, I think starting a mindfulness practice is a great first step.
Excellent. And then the second question we have here is, what do you see moving forward in the next years to come with the current gold standard approaches that may include cognitive behavioral therapy, sound therapy treatments, and then you know, mindfulness, mind body? Really, we're describing a sort of comprehensive best practice in the current age. Where do you see this going in the next few years? What should our community be aware of as things develop?
That's a great question. I think when we talk about the treatments that are available for tinnitus or the treatments that can be created for tinnitus, we kind of divide them into two categories, right? So there are the treatments that we have that are aimed at reducing the maladaptive responses to tinnitus. And honestly, that's what most of the current treatments are about, right? They're not necessarily making the tinnitus signal immediately less prominent. They're changing our response to tinnitus so that hopefully our bodies can habituate to it and it can become softer in the future. But my hope is that as the science of understanding tinnitus and hearing loss improves in the coming years, that we will have more treatment options that are specifically aimed at reducing the tinnitus signal as the first step. And I'm not sure whether that's going to be some sort of gene therapy in the inner ear or whether it's going to be a device like bimodal neuromodulation. I also think that there is some potential that vagal nerve stimulation may be helpful for tinnitus sufferers as a treatment in the future. So I think that's the next frontier, right? We've tried our best to reduce the suffering associated with tinnitus by doing things like mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy, and stress reduction, focusing on promoting better sleep, and all of these kinds of things to try and make it easier for our bodies to fix themselves, to habituate to the tinnitus. But it would be great if we had a more direct treatment that actually just makes the tinnitus sound go away. And we're not there yet, but I'm optimistic that we will get there.
Dr. Brian Worden, very experienced ENT doctor. I'm so glad you're here to share your insights. And to all the people listening who maybe have been told by any kind of doctor that there's nothing they could do or there wasn't a way for them to help, that's not true. This talk was a great example of that. Let's give a virtual round of applause to Dr. Brian Worden. Thank you so much. Hey, it's Dr. Ben Thompson with Treble Health. If you'd like to book a free consultation with a doctor from my team, all you have to do is click the link on the screen right there. Your brain health is important, your hearing is important, and tinnitus is treatable. So reach out to us right here to create a personalized plan for your treatment. Thanks so much, and we'll see you in the next video.